When I was editing the previous video, I noticed that I forgot to include the limitations for the team table, and so I've gone back and added in auto increment to the team ID and set everything else to not null, and I've obviously made the changes to our actual database as well to reflect these changes. I've also gone ahead and populated all of the tables we created with dummy data. So if we look at the player table, for example, we can see that we have all of these player details now recorded. And this is the same for example, the team table, which we've populated with dummy data as well. Because there are so many new rows that we've added, about 1700 in total, I've included the files to actually create all of these dummy data records in the project. So within our Stretch League project, I've created this SQL folder, which includes the populated tables file, which just includes all of these inserts for every single table that we've created. And this is where you'll find the create tables SQL file as well. This is basically the entire script which we created in the last video. So you don't necessarily need to type that all out yourself. So now that we've created our database, and on the PHP side of things we've created our MVC framework, we need to join the two together. And to do that we're going to create a library. So in the library folder we're going to create a new PHP file called database. This file is going to be a class of database, and we're going to extend the PDO framework. PDO is how we're going to connect to the database, and we're just basically going to add some methods onto this framework for ourselves so that we can save ourselves some more time in the long run. So the first thing that we're going to do is to create a construct. Every single time we create a database object, we're going to want to actually log into that database. And so to do that, we're going to type parent construct, and we're going to pass across these options. So rather than putting these options hard-coded into our database library, we're going to actually store these in our config file. So we're going to create a new constant called database. We're going to create multiple ones of these, so I'll just create a couple of copies. The first will be the database type. This is going to be MySQL in our case, but if you're using another SQL engine, we can change that very easily. The next is going to be our host name. In our case, this is going to be workspace. We're then going to create some more of these and create the database name, which is our league, our username, which will be root, and our password, which will be my password. Obviously, if you're going to create your own database, I would recommend changing these username and passwords. So back in our database library, we can actually use this information to construct our class. So we're going to first have the database type, and then we're going to append :host equals, and then our database host. Then we're going to also append on a semicolon in the database name, to which we will append our database name. We then have a comma, and then our database user, and then another comma, and our database password. Now we're going to get a warning here saying that we have the wrong number of parameters, but we've actually included all of the information that we need to, so we don't need to worry about that. So whenever we're actually using our database, we're basically going to be using it for 4 different things: inserting, reading, updating, and deleting. So we can create a unique function for each of those, which means that we don't need to worry about the actual formatting of the SQL later on. So to begin with, we're going to create a select function, because this will also help us test out the fact that our database is connected properly. Now, because we can actually filter our select statements in a lot of different ways, we're going to actually allow ourselves to pass across the entire SQL statement. We're also going to pass across an associative array so that we can actually bind data to our SQL statement. So I'm just going to call this variable values. And this will be an array. So when it comes to actually performing our query, we're first going to create a query variable, which is going to be our prepare statement. And because we're extending PDO, we can just use this. I just need to assign that. We're then going to have our associative array, as I mentioned. And so what we're going to do is we're going to loop through all of the values within that associative array and actually bind them into our query. So we're just going to have a for each loop here for each of the values as a key and a value. And we're going to have to remember to take care when we're using value, because we obviously have value, the singular, and the values, the plural. But all we're going to do is query bind value, and we're going to have the key and the value. We're then going to try to execute our command, and we're actually going to do this inside of an if statement. And if this isn't executed properly, we're going to return an error message. So to return our error message, we're going to require once our controller folder with error.php. If we spelled once correctly as well. And we're going to create a new error and then navigate to our error page. And return, so that we don't continue processing this. If the execute command does execute correctly, we want to actually return our data. So after this, we can then have our final return, which is going to be the query fetch all, and then we're going to need to specify the fetch style. So the fetch style we can actually pass across when we're calling our query, but we can also set a default value. So our default is going to be to set an associative return. That is to say that whenever we have data to return, we're going to return it in an associative array. If you want to, we can override this, but for most of our queries, this is what we're going to be using, and so it makes sense to set that as our default. So now that we have this array set up, we can actually test whether our connection is going to work for us or not. So I'm going to navigate just to the results homepage, just because we didn't have a template for this one. And I'm going to create a new PHP. I'm going to create a new instance of our database. And then also going to use our select command with our SQL, which we're going to actually just have select all from player. And just for simplicity's sake, we're just going to var dump that. So when we go back to our web page now and go to the results index page, we can find out that we have this error, which is saying that the execute command isn't working. So if we go back to our database function, we can see that we've used this, and in fact we should use query. So if we go back to our page now and refresh again, we can see that we've got all of our associative array data. And so we know at this point that our connection's been established correctly, and we're able to actually access and manipulate our data, at least through our select command. If we want to lock this function down a little bit, we could, for example, have select space always at the beginning of this statement. It's up to you how you go about this. In our example, we're going to leave this out, because if we're going to write the vast majority of our SQL statement, it makes sense for us to include the word select as well. But obviously if you do include it here, you would omit it from here. If we wanted to test out our value binding function, we can create a new array here, and all we need to do is create a value to bind to, followed by the value that we're going to bind to it. So in this case we're going to bind the number 7 to the player ID. We would then, in our actual SQL statement, just append the actual binding value into our statement like this. So if we run this again now, we should only get the one value returned, which will be where the player ID is equal to 7. So the next thing we're going to do is to create our insert command. With our insert command, we're going to actually be able to lock this down a lot more. We're just going to ask which table we're going to insert the data into, and what data we're going to insert. So the very first thing that we're going to do is actually split our data into keys and values. So I'm going to create a variable called keys. Notice the multiplicity of this. It's keys, not key. And all we're going to do is implode the array that we have. Again, it helps to assign that. So what we're going to do is, from our data, we're going to create a list of array keys. We're then going to implode this array based on this comma with an apostrophe on either side of it. And we're going to store that as an array in our keys value. We're going to do something similar with the values, except we're also going to prepend this with a semicolon. And again, this is going to be slightly different in that we're going to have comma space colon, and we're going to use the array keys here, again from our data variable. So what this is going to give us is a string, something like value1, comma, space, colon, val2, something like that, while our keys is going to give us something which looks like in fact I won't have this at the beginning. Val1 val2, etc. We're not actually going to put anything at the start or end of this, but later on we will convert this into an actual fully fledged SQL ready string. In that case it will be a tilde apostrophe. And then the next thing that we're going to do is to actually create our query. And that's going to be a prepared statement again. And our statement is going to be insert into $table, which is our value that we're passing across. Then in brackets we're going to have our keys. And then the word values. And then in brackets again our actual values. Now because when we were creating this string earlier we only had these apostrophes on the inner parts of each element, we also need to put them on the outer parts, like so. This just saves us having to append multiple things onto this statement up here. We can just do it once down here. So as with our select statement, we're also going to bind the values that we're passing across. And so we're just going to change this back to the data, because we want it as an array, not actually as strings. Then, like with our select statement, we're also going to try to execute our command. If not, we're going to create another error. And I'll just copy all of this across, because it's going to be the exact same thing. If the insert was successful, however, we wanted to return the ID of the new record. And this will mean that we don't have to search for that data later on. We're just going to pass that insert record ID back immediately. So again, we can test this out on our results index page. If we delete this line, in fact I'll just comment that out. So if we create a new insert command now, and we're going to insert into the player table. And the values that we're going to insert will be an array, and the player name is going to be J Smith. And what I'm going to do is just echo that out. So if we refresh our page now and go to the source so that we can actually see our output, we can see that this has been reported as 301. We obviously didn't put this inside of a paper shadow element, which is why it didn't show up on the page itself. We can, however, select this element now. So if I go back and comment this out and echo out a select statement, we're going to select all from player where player ID equals 301. And just so that this does show up on the page, we'll put in our paper shadow. And if we refresh again this time, we're going to get this error message because our return value is an array. So that instead of echo, that should be a var dump. And this time if we refresh, we're going to get our player data. In reality, we obviously wouldn't just var dump all of this information out, we would actually stylize it and put it in some sort of context. But this is obviously just so that we can prove that our functions are working as we're going along. So the next thing that we need to do is our update class. With our update class, we're going to ask for the table, the data that's going to be updated, and also a where clause. We specifically want a where clause in this case, so we're not going to put a default here, because if you update without a where clause, you will update everything within a single table, which is obviously not something that we're going to want to do. So the first thing I'm going to do is just to perform a key sort on our data. This just makes the SQL code a bit easier to work with if we need to debug it later on. I'm then going to create a new variable called the data string, which we're going to initialize as a blank string. We're then going to loop through each element within our data and append it to our data string. Because we're going to be actually creating the SQL to bind to ourselves, we need to do this differently than we have done in the past, for example with the insert statement. So after we've created this string, we're just going to create another string, which is going to be our cleaned version, which we're just going to create from trimming our data string. And we're just going to want to remove the final comma. So now comes our actual query. Again, we're going to use a prepared statement. And we're going to type update table set, and then our data string cleaned, where, and then our where. So then we need to do the things that we've done for our update command again. So I'll just copy that across. So we're just going to bind our key and values across based on our data input. So this is all exactly going to be the same, followed by an error message if we're unable to execute. But in this instance, we're not going to be able to return any useful information. So instead, we're going to return false if there's an error, and return true if we're able to update correctly. So by using this, we're actually able to turn our function into a Boolean value, rather than just returning no data at all. So what we're going to do now is to update our database. So I'll create a copy of this. And we're going to update. In fact, I'll create another copy of this as well. Our table is going to be player. We're going to set an array We're going to set our player name to an example. And in this case we're going to set our player ID equals 301. So as we can see, we already have this player 301 whose name is J Smith. If we refresh this now, we get our boolean true because we've changed our record, and we can see by selecting the data that we've changed it to an example. So the last function that we're going to need within our database is the ability to delete records. The delete function is much easier than all of the other functions because we're not going to need to validate any data. All we're going to need to ask for is the table, the where condition, and we're also going to set a limit, which we're going to default to 1 record. And this is just almost an override protection, just to make sure that we don't accidentally delete our entire database. So all we're going to do is return this, execute, delete from table where limit. Now we obviously don't need to prepare this statement or bind any data values to it, and so this entire function is going to be much simpler. So if we go back across to our page which we're using to demonstrate, and all we're going to do is replace this with a delete. So player where player ID equals 301, and we're going to have the number 1 returned to us, which is the boolean true, and then we can see that we don't have any output because we've deleted all of our output. So now that we've created a link between our database and our actual PHP script, we're going to be able to begin to actually create our templates, which we're going to want to do with Polymer, and we're going to do that over our next few videos. So make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss it. Get all of our output data, and it's all going to be grouped into each week. So this first element is going to have 10 elements within it. Then we're going to have our second element, which is going to have the next 10 elements. It only happens to be 10 elements because that's how many fixtures we have each week. If we had less or more fixtures per week, we would obviously have the corresponding amount of elements per array entry.